Welcome to our deep dive into the world of religious organizations. We've got a stack of fascinating sources about churches and sects, cults, and, well, everything in between.
Everything in between.
Yeah.
Wow.
Ever wonder, what makes a church different from a sect?
Or,
Or how groups like Scientology and the Moonies attract such devoted followers?
yeah,
That's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
that's right.
So first things first, our sources introduce this sociologist named Ernst Troeltsch.
Okay.
It's kind of the OG of religious classifications,
Yeah.
right? He came up with this idea of church versus sect, and it seems like that distinction is still relevant today.
Absolutely. Troeltsch argued that churches are the big established players. Like think Christianity or Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Huge, influential, and they often claim a monopoly on truth.
Right.
Sects, on the other hand, are like the splinter groups, smaller, more exclusive, demanding a lot from their members.
Okay.
And often at odds with mainstream society.
So are sects always super strict and secretive? I mean, we've all heard those stories about cults and compounds, but are all sects like that?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
While some sects can be quite strict, it's important to remember that the defining characteristic is their separation from mainstream society and their claim to a more exclusive truth.
Right.
They might be more demanding of their members, but not all of them operating in secrecy or engaging in harmful practices.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So if churches are the mainstream and sects are the splinter groups, where do denominations fit in? Our sources mentioned those too.
Denominations are interesting because they fall somewhere in between churches and sects.
Right.
Think of them like different branches of a larger religious tradition.
Right.
For example, within Christianity, you have denominations like Catholicism, Protestantism, and within Protestantism, you have even more specific denominations like Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians.
Okay, so different flavors of the same religion.
Exactly. They share some cool beliefs, but might have different interpretations of certain doctrines or practices.
Gotcha.
Denominations tend to be less rigid than sects and are generally more integrated into mainstream society.
Got it. So churches, sects, denominations, we've got a lot of categories here.
We do.
But then there are the groups that everyone seems to be fascinated by, cults.
Ah, yes, cults.
Let's go.
The word itself evokes a certain mystique, doesn't it?
It does.
Our sources mention groups like Scientology with its e-meters and auditing,
Right.
and the Moonies, known for their mass weddings.
Yeah.
These groups tend to be viewed with more suspicion. Well, from what I understand, Reverend Moon, the founder of the Unification Church, believed he was chosen by God to complete the work that Jesus started.
Oh.
He saw these mass weddings as a way to create a unified world transcending cultural and racial barriers through marriage.
So it's not just about the spectacle. There's actually a deeper meaning behind it.
Exactly. For Moon and his followers, these mass weddings are a symbolic act with profound spiritual significance.
Okay, so we've got churches, sects, denominations, and cults.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a whole spectrum of religious organizations out there.
There is?
But as we're diving into these categories, I'm noticing that things aren't always so clear-cut.
Yeah.
Our sources mention the Nation of Islam often labeled a sect. But they also have some characteristics of a church, like their focus on social justice.
You've hit on a really important point.
Oh.
These categories, while useful, are not always black and white.
Right.
The Nation of Islam is a great example of how a group can blur the lines between categories. They have a strong focus on community upliftment, similar to some churches, but their theology differs from mainstream Islam, which has led to their classification as a sect.
So sometimes a group might have elements of both a church and a sect, making it difficult to categorize neatly.
Exactly.
This is getting really interesting. Now that we've laid the groundwork with these different types of religious organizations, let's dive deeper into how these groups function and evolve.
Welcome back to our deep dive.
It's amazing to think about how much influence religious organizations have had on the world.
I know, right?
It's like they're not just about personal beliefs. They can have a huge impact on society and politics, too.
Yeah.
Remember how our sources talked about the rise of the religious right in the U.S.? That really shows how powerful a group can be when their beliefs get tied up with politics.
Exactly. The religious right is a great example. This movement, largely made up of evangelical Christians, has really become a force in American politics, especially since the 1980s. Our sources pointed to Ronald Reagan's presidency as a turning point.
Yeah.
His appeal to evangelical voters really helped solidify their political power.
It's kind of mind-blowing how that works.
Mhm.
You have this group of people who are deeply committed to their faith, and then they start seeing connections between their religious beliefs and their political choices. And suddenly you've got a powerful voting bloc.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And it's not just about voting. The religious right has been very active in pushing for policies that reflect their values.
Yeah.
Like opposition to abortion and same-sex marriage. One of our sources, Jim Wallace, actually argued that this movement is all about using biblical teachings to shape laws and social policies.
So it's like they're trying to bring their religious beliefs into the public sphere, not just keep them private.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be controversial. But let's switch gears for a second. I'm curious, what is it about these groups, especially the ones that seem a bit out there, that attracts people in the first place? Like, why would someone join a group like Scientology or the Moonies?
Well, it's really about understanding human needs and motivations. People join religious organizations for all sorts of reasons. For some, it's about community and belonging. Humans are social creatures. We crave connection.
Right.
So finding a group of like-minded people who share your values can be incredibly appealing.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, everyone wants to feel like they belong somewhere, right? And religion can offer that, especially if you feel like you're not fitting in elsewhere.
Absolutely. And for others, it's about finding meaning and purpose in life. Religion can provide answers to those big existential questions. Why are we here? What's the point of it all? Having a framework for understanding the world can bring comfort and a sense of direction, especially during difficult times.
So it's like having a map for life, kind of. But what about the role of leaders? Our sources mention that charismatic leaders are often a big draw for these groups.
Oh, absolutely. Leaders play a huge role. Think about someone like Jim Jones or Reverend Moon. These were incredibly charismatic figures who could inspire and motivate people on a massive scale. People are drawn to strong personalities. And in the context of religion, this can be especially powerful. But as we've seen, it can also be dangerous if that power is misused.
It's like a double-edged sword, right?
It is.
A charismatic leader can inspire amazing things, but they can also exploit people's vulnerabilities. It's a reminder to be cautious and think critically, even when you're drawn to a group's message or its leader. I'm curious, how do you think the appeal of these groups differs across the different types we talked about earlier, like churches, sects, and cults?
That's a great question. Churches, with their long history and established traditions, often appeal to people who are seeking stability and continuity. They offer a connection to the past, a sense of belonging within a larger narrative that's been passed down for generations.
So it's like having a spiritual anchor, something solid to hold on to.
Exactly. While sects, with their emphasis on strict adherence to a particular set of beliefs, might appeal to people who are looking for a more intense and exclusive religious experience. They often see themselves as the true or pure form of a particular faith, which can be very appealing to people who are disillusioned with mainstream religion.
So they're looking for something more demanding, something that sets them apart.
Yes, and that exclusivity can be a powerful bonding force.
Yeah.
Then you have cults, which are often shrouded in secrecy and tend to have very unconventional beliefs and practices.
Right.
They often target people who are feeling lost or vulnerable, offering them simple answers and a sense of purpose in a chaotic world.
It's interesting how the different types of groups seem to cater to different psychological needs.
Yeah.
You know? But this all begs the question, what are the risks and benefits of actually joining one of these groups? That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've covered so much ground already. We've explored the different types of religious organizations, from churches to sects and cults.
Yeah.
And we've delved into why people might be drawn to these groups.
Yeah.
But I think it's time to talk about the elephant in the room.
Okay.
Are there risks involved in joining these groups?
That's a really important question. And honestly, it's not always easy to answer. Like we've been saying, these groups aren't all created equal.
Right.
Some can offer amazing benefits, a sense of community, purpose, support, even a spiritual framework for navigating life. But there's also the potential for harm.
Yeah.
And our sources definitely don't shy away from that.
Yeah. The story of the People's Temple and what happened in Jonestown is a tragic reminder that things can go very wrong within these groups. I mean, it's chilling to think about how a charismatic leader like Jim Jones, who started with good intentions, could end up leading his followers down such a dark path.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that power, even in a religious context, can be incredibly seductive and easily misused.
Right.
It highlights the need for critical thinking and discernment, both for individuals considering joining a group and for society as a whole.
So how can people tell the difference between a healthy religious group and one that might be harmful? Are there any red flags to watch out for?
It's tough because there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But some warning signs might include groups that isolate their members from family and friends, demand unquestioning obedience to the leader, or control members' finances and personal decisions. And any group that uses guilt or fear to maintain control should definitely raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, it's like you always have the right to walk away if something feels off.
Right.
Your well-being should never be compromised, no matter how compelling a group's message might seem.
Hmm.
We've talked a lot about the different classifications of religious organizations, but earlier we also touched on how those lines can get blurry. Does this complexity make it harder to judge these groups from an ethical standpoint?
It definitely adds another layer of complexity. What might be considered acceptable in one context could be problematic in another.
Right.
Take the Nation of Islam, for example. They're often classified as a sect, but they also advocate for social justice and Black empowerment goals that resonate with many people. However, their separatist ideology and unique theological interpretations have also drawn criticism.
So it's not as simple as slapping a label on a group and saying, okay, this is good or this is bad.
Yeah.
You really have to look deeper. Consider the context, the specific beliefs, and the impact they're having.
Exactly. And our sources also brought up this really interesting tension between religious freedom and the potential for harm, especially when it comes to groups like cults. We want to respect people's right to choose their own beliefs and practices,
Right.
but we also have a responsibility to protect individuals from exploitation and abuse.
That's such a tricky balance. Where do you draw the line?
It's not an easy question, and it often comes down to difficult judgment calls. Each case needs to be evaluated on its own merits, looking at the specific circumstances and the potential for harm. There's no simple formula.
It sounds like navigating this whole world of religious organizations requires a lot of critical thinking and nuance. It's not just about accepting things at face value. It's about asking questions, challenging assumptions, and being willing to grapple with the complexities.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good takeaway from our deep dive today. We've explored these groups from all angles, their history, their structure, their appeal, their potential for both good and bad.
Right.
But ultimately, it's up to each individual to approach these groups with a critical eye and make informed choices about their own involvement or lack thereof.
We've gone from grand cathedrals to intimate gatherings, from political platforms to personal stories of faith. It's been quite a journey. So as we wrap up, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to remember that understanding religious organizations is an ongoing process. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep the conversation going.
Perfectly said. That's what makes a deep dive truly rewarding. It's not just about getting answers. It's about sparking curiosity and continuing the exploration long after the episode is over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning and keep questioning.